人类自古以来就想挑战攀登高峰的极限，从埃及的金字塔、中亚巴比伦塔，到20世纪的高楼大厦，几千年来从未停止。随着科技发达，特别是电梯的改良，人类已经找到用最快的速度爬到最高地方的方法，那就是透过摩天大楼。值得一提的是，台北101这座世界最高的摩天大楼纪录，很快的将会被杜拜、纽约、上海、芝加哥等地的摩天大楼赶过。
台湾拥有全世界最高的摩天大楼，到现在为止有长达2年的时间了。在这2年当中，我们到底有没有机会了解一下摩天大楼对于人类代表的是什么样的意义呢？
In the summer of 1929, war broke out on the island of Manhattan. But it was not a battle for the ground. It was a battle for the sky. The Woolworth Building was the tallest in the world, and it helped to make the five and dime empire famous. Now, automobile tycoon Walter Chrysler wanted to build a new skyscraper that would be even taller. It would be decorated with designs resembling hubcaps and hood ornaments, and Chrysler hoped it would make his fledgling company a household name. But further downtown, another company had the same idea. A Wall Street powerhouse, the Bank of Manhattan, was building a skyscraper designed to top Chrysler's by 30 feet. The Great War of the Skyscrapers was on. Through the summer and fall, the two buildings battled back and forth, tit for tat, capturing the public's imagination as they rose.
People would talk to each other on the subway about it, what had they heard, what was the most recent news on this competition for height.
First, Chrysler added several stories to his tower. The bank retaliated with more floors and an ornamental crown. Chrysler went even higher, completing construction at the dizzying height of 925 feet. But adding a 50-foot flagpole, the bank squeaked past the Chrysler building by a mere 2 feet. As the bank celebrated victory, Walter Chrysler pulled a rabbit out of his hat. On a brisk morning in November 1929, a small crew jacked a needle-thin spire hidden in Chrysler's building through the top of the crown to claim the title of world's tallest at 1,046 feet. The hard-fought victory made Chrysler's building and his cars icons the world over. Today, the Chrysler building is no longer the tallest in the world. But the quest for height continues, and along the way has produced skyscrapers that are some of the most awesome and extravagant achievements in engineering and architecture.
A skyscraper is romance, it's drama, it's passion, it's symbol, it's architectural beauty, it's an icon of a city and of a community and sometimes even of an entire country.
Skyscrapers are the nerve centers of the modern world. No structure in history has had a greater impact on the way we live and work. How did we learn to build these marvels of technology that stretch a quarter of a mile high and etch such fantastic skylines? Coming next on Building Big, skyscrapers. Today, the ancient Italian town of San Gimignano, with its extraordinary skyline of medieval towers, is overrun by curious visitors. Though there were over 70 of these primitive skyscrapers 800 years ago, only a dozen still stand. They were built because the town was plagued not by tourists, but by violent and bloody warfare.
San Gimignano at that time was in the crossroad of one of the main roads to Rome, pilgrimage roads to Rome. Merchant class of San Gimignano used to travel all over the Mediterranean. So that made San Gimignano the focus point for trading.
Trade made the town wealthy, and that wealth made it a target of invasion.
Italy was, in a phase of its history, very chaotic. Continuously warring, battle time, anytime, everywhere.
To protect itself, the village built a high stone wall. And behind that wall, individual families built a second line of defense. These tall stone towers.
The people of San Gimignano built their towers like everyone else did back then, by simply piling stones one on top of another and cementing them together with mortar. Now, these are load-bearing walls. What that means is that they must support not only their own weight, but the weight of the floors and all the things on the floors, people, furniture, barrels, everything, all the way up to the roof. To keep these towers from teetering as they were being built, the walls are made thicker at the bottom. The taller the tower, the thicker the wall, the stronger the foundation has to be. But if the foundation hadn't been strong, these towers could have collapsed, or they might have settled unevenly like their more famous cousin in Pisa. But these are clearly strong towers. It's the thick walls that create more interesting problems. The lower walls of these towers are almost 6 feet thick, which doesn't give us a lot of floor space. And since windows are basically holes in the wall, you can't have too many or you'll weaken the whole structure. So there isn't much light here either. What this means is most of the rooms in these towers were very cramped and very dark. But the people of San Gimignano didn't mind this because thick, virtually windowless walls were perfect for defense. As long as the food and water lasted, they could safely get through a siege, sometimes for months. And the towers had another important advantage. From here on top, you could easily see the enemy approaching, and you'd have plenty of time to choose the most appropriate greeting. Boiling water, arrows, garbage, anything. But why did the people of this little town build so many towers?
The citizens of San Gimignano were not only battling invading enemies, they were fighting among themselves. San Gimignano was the site of a bloody feud between two of its most powerful families, the Ardinghellis and the Salvuccis. Time and again, the Ardinghellis would attack the Salvuccis and drive them out of town, only to have the tables turned on them soon after.
This battle, she was more than a battle. All these conflicts went on for about a century and a half. People that lost were either killed or casted out, so the other family came back, took over, and imposing their own people. The effect was that it was a continuous turnover of the city government.
Each time power shifted, the winning family built a new, even taller tower to prove its dominance. And the losers began plotting their revenge. It was this vicious cycle that created one of the world's most picturesque skylines. Elsewhere in Europe, a less violent but equally fierce competition would give rise to the most daring structures the world had ever seen. Unlike the towers of San Gimignano, Gothic cathedrals were designed to hold thousands of people. Towering symbols of the power of the church, These were the skyscrapers of medieval France. And they sparked not only awe, but envy, as each new cathedral tried to outdo its predecessor in height and grandeur. So in the year 1210, when the great cathedral at Reims burned to the ground, the archbishop seized the opportunity to trump his rivals. Barely had the ashes cooled before he set out to raise the most extravagant cathedral yet. Not only was it intended to be taller than all the others, huge windows would flood its interior with sunlight.
C'est le besoin de lumière. La lumière, c'est Dieu.
In the Middle Ages, there was a need for light. Light is God. And to convey the image of God, a cathedral must have windows that are very high, so that its interior is saturated with this divine light.
To put large windows in the walls of a masonry building required techniques known only to a select group of builders. Master masons who were privy to the secrets of medieval architecture and engineering. One of the most experienced master masons in France was hired to carry out the archbishop's plans. Named Jean d'Orbay, he would command a team of workers armed with tools and machines that were the predecessors of those found on any modern construction site.
They had to lift material to great heights. After all, the vaulted ceilings were 150 feet high. So the crane appears, making it possible to lift heavy objects by hand. They had another contraption called a squirrel. It was like a big wheel, pedaled by the workers' feet. And it was capable of generating enormous leverage. And in Gothic construction, we see the first wheelbarrow. If I might be so bold, I might even say that it was the first industrial revolution, the first big revolution in technology, which radically changed the history of man.
But even with the latest medieval tools, how could Jean d'Orbay create such vast windows without weakening the cathedral's heavy stone walls?
Well, the first answer are these thick stone piers that line this large space called the nave. This is where the worshippers generally gather. On the other side of the piers is a wide aisle for pilgrims and admirers to walk around the church without interfering with the worshippers.
These piers support most of the weight of the building and the roof. So the church's outer walls can be filled with glass. But the master masons ran into a problem when they decided to construct a ceiling from stone instead of wood to prevent fires. A stone ceiling is extremely heavy. And because it has to be arched in order to span the wide church, its ends push outward against the walls and piers. Without reinforcement, walls with large windows would collapse outward and the ceiling would fall.
So the Gothic builders had to push back. They did this with long stone arms called flying buttresses.
This external framework of flying buttresses, supported by heavy external piers, was the master mason's secret to creating cathedrals with glass walls. But carrying out such elaborate engineering took huge sums of money. And the townspeople were often stuck shouldering a large part of the bill. In fact, 20 years into construction at Reims, with the cathedral only half built, the citizens staged a bloody revolt. Fed up, they seized control and halted construction for 2 years. Once the king restored order, it took another 30 years to complete the cathedral. With structures like Reims, Gothic cathedrals exceeded the practical limits of stone. Centuries would pass before it would make sense to build skyward again. And once more, France would take center stage. In the 1880s, the French solicited designs for a tall structure that would be the centerpiece of the World's Fair in Paris. An engineer named Gustave Eiffel, already well known for his long, soaring wrought iron bridges, proposed a tower that would, in effect, resemble a metal bridge turned on its end. Eiffel's design won the commission, but when it was unveiled to the public, critics called it an eyesore and said it would be too expensive. But Eiffel knew better. As strong as stone, iron is much lighter and can be produced in any size, shape, or quantity. Eiffel assembled the 12,000 pieces of the tower in just 21 months, in time for the fair's opening day. The exhibition halls were brimming with the latest technological wonders, such as the telephone and the phonograph. But what people really came to see was the unveiling of the tallest man-made structure in the world. The Eiffel Tower stole the show. Eiffel's Great Tower showed the potential of iron to take buildings to unprecedented heights. One could imagine simply covering the giant metal skeleton with thin walls, and voila, you'd have a 1,000-foot skyscraper.
But what's so great about a very tall building when you've got endless stairs to climb? There are over 1,700 of them here. I wouldn't want to have to do this carrying the groceries. Without elevators, very tall buildings would have remained impractical. Now, there had been elevators long before Eiffel built his tower, but no one had ever tried to install one in such a tall structure. For this task, he turned to the American elevator company founded by Elisha Graves Otis. Elevators had been used in factories and warehouses for years. But since they were not considered safe, cargo could ride, but people had to climb the stairs. In 1854, Elisha Otis changed all that with a contraption he devised called a safety hoister. As Otis stood on an elevator platform suspended high above a crowd of gasping onlookers, an assistant cut the hoisting cable. To everyone's amazement, the elevator dropped only a few inches, rather than sending Otis plunging to his death. What Otis had invented was a mechanical braking system that would activate if the lifting cable snapped. With elevators safe for passengers, the height of a building would never again be limited by the number of steps people could climb. Gustave Eiffel installed 2 Otis elevators in his tower. A shrewd entrepreneur, he knew people would pay to ride 1,000 feet into the sky to see the view from the top of the world. Elevator ticket sales recouped almost the entire cost of the structure in just 1 year. And Eiffel became one of the richest men in France. Though Eiffel's Great Tower was a triumph of engineering, the potential of the metal frame would be fully realized in American cities like Chicago, where it would create spectacular skylines and new ways to live and work.
Chicago is not the biggest American city. It's not the center of the American economy. It's not the center of American culture. But it's a wonderful, strong, powerful city that has perhaps the greatest architectural culture in America, and is very closely tied in with the creation of the skyscraper.
People in Chicago feel associated with skyscrapers as one of the defining qualities of the city. the number of tall, beautiful buildings that were built in Chicago towards the end of the 19th century is extraordinary. And the quality of those buildings is fabulous.
Chicago's love affair with the skyscraper began in tragedy. In 1871, fire swept through the city, burning much of the boomtown to the ground. 17,000 buildings were lost, and hundreds of people perished. But instead of destroying Chicago forever, the fire gave rise to a new kind of city, sprung from the rubble and ashes.
Chicago was a very high-energy place. It was a city that had this momentum, as it just was literally falling all over itself, growing and prospering and trying new things. Noisy, smoky, streetcars clanging, just like kind of a busy beehive of commercial activity.
The city of Chicago would soon be home to everything from the world's largest stockyards and meatpacking plants to mail order and retail giants like Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. As Chicago's businesses grew by leaps and bounds, thousands of people flocked to the city to take jobs in 5- and 6-story office buildings downtown. Bordered by rivers, railroad yards, and Lake Michigan, Chicago's small business district, called the Loop, was bursting at the seams.
And with all the people and businesses coming in, the cities downtown didn't have the space to hold them all. So the only way to go was up.
As the story goes, the modern skyscraper was born when engineer William LeBaron Jenney was designing a building for the home insurance company. Feeling ill one day, he left work early.
So he shows up at his home, goes to sit in his favorite easy chair, and there, sitting on the seat, is this big old photo album. Photo albums used to be like these big old brick-like books. Mrs. Jenney went and swept the book off the chair so he could sit down and set it on top of a wire bird cage. And that Jenney was sitting in his chair, and he looks up, and here's this big, heavy book sitting on top of this slender wire bird cage. Why, if that thin bird cage could hold that big, heavy book, why, what if? And there came the idea for skeletal construction.
What Jenney supposedly saw was that a metal cage could replace heavy, load-bearing walls to support a tall building. If you look inside just about any tall building today, you'll see a framework of vertical columns and horizontal beams. Instead of thick walls holding up the building, this thin skeleton does the job. The weight of the building and everything inside it is transferred from the beams to the columns and down to the foundation. Seen from the top, the building receives additional support and stiffness from a set of heavy interior columns. These columns enclose a space called the building's core, where the elevators, stairwells, and bathrooms are generally located.
The space around the core is wide open, so we can fill it with people and desks and chairs. We can throw up petitions for offices and departments. And since the weight of the building is supported by the steel skeleton, the exterior wall supports nothing. Whatever eventually encloses this space is really just a skin to keep out the weather, so we can have as many windows as we want. I mean, just look around me. The steel frame brought floor space and light to the structure we now know as the modern skyscraper.
And it was essentially this system, a metal frame supporting thin brick walls, that William LeBaron Jenney used in the building he was designing. But when it was going up, people were so worried Jenney's newfangled building would fall down that construction was halted while the safety of the structure was investigated. Although the public was skeptical, entrepreneurs were not. they erected dozens of tall metal frame office buildings throughout the loop. But the skyscraper's early success quickly became its undoing.
As the streets of Chicago began to rapidly be filled up with these tall buildings, people became really concerned that the streets, which used to be filled with sunlight as the sun moved across the sky, would be nothing but dark, lightless canyons in shadow.
In 1893, Chicago restricted the height of new buildings to 130 feet, about 10 stories, even though the metal frame could go much, much higher. And that's exactly what the skyscraper did in New York, where there was no height limit. Like Chicago, New York was a city with a problem. The island of Manhattan had too many people and not enough land. The need for more and more vertical office space turned into a quest for height.
One of the advantages of building the world's tallest building is that the building immediately gets worldwide publicity. Every two-bit journal around the world carries a story on it. And it's why so many of the 20th century's early skyscrapers had corporate names attached.
From the turn of the century, the race for the title of the world's tallest was on. Singer sewing machines, 47 stories. Metropolitan Life Insurance, 50 stories. Woolworths, 55 stories. Chrysler, 77 stories.
It was the 1920s. The economy was booming. People were boozing. It was a wild time, and this race for the world's tallest, or the race for any superlative, was endemic, it seems.
And that frenzy gave rise to the Empire State Building, with twice as much rental space as the Chrysler Building. Developers were convinced it would make a fortune. But just as work was beginning, the stock market went into a tailspin. Nearly all construction in New York City ground to a halt. But the developers of the Empire State Building did not. Hoping the economy would turn around, they forged ahead at full speed. The most ambitious skyscraper project ever attempted, the Empire State Building would require 4,000 workers and 50,000 pieces of steel. Not only was it the tallest and largest office building in the world, it was built in the heart of one of the most crowded cities.
One of the enormous problems in constructing a building such as the Empire State Building is space. The most desirable place to put up a building of this nature is where the area is already developed. And where can you store the stuff that you have to build with?
The construction firm Starrett Brothers and Eakin, headed by Colonel William Starrett and his brother Paul, were undaunted. They promised to finish the building in record time, just 18 months. So they would not have a mountain of raw materials to store on 5th Avenue and 34th Street. The Starretts had as much of the Empire State Building as possible prefabricated off-site. Brought to the crowded city only when needed, mass-produced building components from structural beams to decorative metal trim could be assembled quickly, like pieces of a giant kit.
Colonel Starrett said the Empire State Building was the equivalent of working on an assembly line. Only instead of the workers being stationary and the work passing in front of them, they moved from site to site, and the assembly line, as it were, stayed still.
And like an assembly line, every step of the construction process was designed for speed and efficiency. The Starretts had tracks laid on every floor so men could distribute materials quickly using small rail cars. So workers would not waste time traveling up and down on their lunch break, the builders installed cafeterias on 5 different levels. With the Starretts pushing construction to a fever pitch, The frame rose at a record rate that reached more than a story a day. It's said that steel beams were installed still warm from the furnaces in Pittsburgh. In just 6 months, an army of men assembled almost 3 times as much steel as in the Chrysler Building. And covered it with 50,000 pieces of heavy limestone facing. With the cost of materials and labor at a 10-year low, the Starretts finished millions of dollars under budget and weeks ahead of schedule. And tourists in the Chrysler Building now had to look up 200 feet to the top of the Empire State Building.
May 1st, 1931, and the tallest building in the world is open for the first time. And there it is. It's open for business.
But behind the fanfare, financial disaster loomed. In a depression economy, the Empire State Building was less than 25% occupied. It was nicknamed the Empty State Building. Managers took to leaving lights on in vacant offices to fool prospective tenants. For the Starretts, the breakneck pace of construction had been too much. Paul suffered a nervous breakdown, and Colonel Starrett was dead within a year. More than a decade later, as World War II was drawing to a close, disaster would put the Starretts' labors to the ultimate test.
On a foggy Saturday morning in July 1945, a B-25, 10-ton, 2-engine bomber crashed into the 79th and 80th floors of the north wall of the Empire State Building.
Flaming gasoline spewed through the building, charring offices and office workers alike. All 3 people on the plane and 11 others inside the building were killed.
This happened on a Saturday morning. By Monday morning at 8:30, the building was open for business. True, there were girders that were bent out of shape, but you have to realize that the 10-ton plane hitting a 360,000-ton building is like a toddler trying to tackle a middle linebacker.
Though it barely shuddered, the Empire State Building had been battered by near bankruptcy, personal tragedy, and fiery catastrophe. It seemed skyscrapers might have reached their limits. In the 1950s, as the country awoke from depression and war, it became a very different place. The population and the economy were booming. The interest in building tall resumed. Businesses needed inexpensive office buildings, and they needed them quickly. The Empty State Building was no longer empty. But skyscrapers cloaked in heavy stone wall panels like the Empire State Building cost too much to build. So architects abandoned stone for light, thin sheets of glass and metal, which made buildings faster to assemble and much more affordable.
We were at a time when, yes, the world was changing. It was the post-war period. There was a certain amount of desire for a new form of expression. But in truth, glass boxes became really common because they were cheap. They could be replicated very cheaply and easily.
This sleek new look was called the International style. For better or for worse, modern glass boxes sprang up all over the world.
People have always had very mixed feelings about skyscrapers. I think they became more negative as glass boxes became more and more common everywhere. And the key thing about architecture in a city is that the buildings work together. Yet, modern buildings don't do that very well. Even the best of them want to be a thing unto themselves.
Appearance was not the only problem. These buildings held a surprise for engineers. Stripped of heavy materials like stone wall panels, glass boxes are very light. And the lighter and taller a building, the more it can sway in the wind. If a building sways too much, people inside will actually become seasick. To build tall glass skyscrapers, engineers needed a new way to stiffen their frames without adding too much expensive steel. One solution was to move most of the structure of columns and beams from the inside of the building to the perimeter. That way, the skyscraper acts like a hollow, rigid tube, making it just as strong and stiff as a traditional frame, but with much less steel. The World Trade Center was built this way, allowing it to seize the title of world's tallest from the Empire State Building. But the record books had to be rewritten again, about a year later, when Chicago stole the title from New York with the colossal 110-story Sears Tower. The tube frame took the art of building tall to new heights. Yet engineers wanted to find a way to build lighter skyscrapers using even less steel. At New York's Citicorp Center, that quest brought them face to face with disaster.
When it was finished, the Citicorp building was the 7th tallest skyscraper in the world. And with its glass and aluminum skin, it was also one of the lightest. Now, light buildings use less material, so they cost less, which is why builders love them. But remember, light buildings also sway a lot more in the wind than their heavier cousins do. So structural engineer Bill LeMessurier had to come up with some way of keeping the inhabitants of Citicorp from getting seasick 60 floors up. His solution was to put a mechanical device called a tuned mass damper up near the very top of the building.
Perched on the 63rd floor of Citicorp Center, above all the offices, the tuned mass damper is a 400-ton block of concrete, so large it had to be poured in place before the building was finished.
When the sensors detect motion of the building way below the level of human perception, but a level high enough to realize that it's not just a truck going by in the street, but the wind is building up, then the pumps come on, cause this thing to be lifted and go into action.
Tied to the building by giant springs and shock absorbers, the concrete block begins to slide from side to side on a cushion of oil. When the building sways one way, the block follows. As the building begins to sway in the other direction, the massive block damps or reduces the motion. Within about a minute, the movement of the building drops to an acceptable level. The tuned mass damper makes this super light skyscraper feel as stable as one stiffened with much more steel.
The Citicorp building was the first skyscraper designed to use a tuned mass damper. Now they're in buildings all over the world. If the damper and Citicorp's striking shape had been the only features to distinguish the building, the engineers would have been very happy. But unfortunately, there were other problems left to solve.
Those problems resulted from another of Citicorp's idiosyncrasies. The skyscraper was built 9 stories in the air on 4 tall columns to make room for a church under one corner. But just after Citicorp Center was completed, LeMessurier received an innocent phone call about the design that turned out to be a matter of life and death.
I got a telephone call from a student who was assigned to write a paper on this building by his professor. The professor had said there was something funny about this building because the columns were not in the corners like they ought to be.
LeMessurier explained to the student that he had placed the columns between the corners for good reason. In the early 1970s, when Citicorp was still on the drawing board, St. Peter's, an old church in disrepair, occupied one corner of the potential building site. Citicorp struck a deal with the church to demolish St. Peter's and rebuild a modern church in exchange for the right to build its skyscraper in the air just above it. Lemessurier had to place the skyscraper's heavy support columns on the center of each side so St. Peter's could fit under one corner. What made this possible, he explained to the student, was the building's extraordinary frame, a series of diagonal steel beams arranged like giant V's, channel gravity and wind loads from the corners of the building to its 4 center columns.
And that was the end of the conversation with the student.
But that student's phone call got Lemessurier thinking. A few weeks earlier, he had learned that there had been a change in the way the building was constructed. Hundreds of joints in the V-braces that were to be welded were instead bolted together to save money. It was standard practice according to the building code, but out of curiosity, Lemessurier analyzed how the substitution of bolts for welds changed the strength of the V-braces.
I pursued this, and I went to New York, and we pulled out from our own records the detailed numbers on all these joints, and found out some very awesome and frightening facts.
To his surprise, Lemessurier discovered that strong winds from a diagonal direction could sever the bolts in the V-braces and rip the joints apart.
I came to the conclusion that a storm which had a probability of occurring every 16 years, or once in 16 years, would cause the building to fail, break, and collapse. If I do nothing, this thing has a high probability of falling down in my lifetime. This is an intolerable situation. I can't live with that.
Lemessurier devised a plan to reinforce the hundreds of bolted joints by welding large steel plates over them. But so many repairs would take time, and time was something he did not have. It was July, and hurricane season was just around the corner. Every available welder from as far away as Louisiana was rushed to the building to begin repairs. While they worked under the cover of darkness to avoid panic, the Red Cross and city officials held secret meetings to prepare for the worst.
The scenario was very clear that a sustained wind of over 70 miles an hour could tip this building right over. There are tens of thousands of people right here in this neighborhood. We could be talking thousands of casualties here.
The building is 900 feet tall. So if it breaks off somewhere a couple of hundred feet above the ground and falls north, it will lie on the top of other buildings, all the way to Bloomingdale's.
The possible impact zone extended about 6 blocks around the Citicorp building, an area that holds several 100,000 people. Trying to evacuate them on a moment's notice might have been futile.
There isn't a lot of reality to think you can evacuate Midtown Manhattan. You have to play a scenario as to what time of day, what day of the week. 5 o'clock rush hour, not very real to think that you can evacuate Midtown Manhattan.
The welding took several weeks, and the job stretched into early September, just as Hurricane Ella was blowing north. If the winds were right, she would hit New York City within days.
We had 3 different weather services constantly reporting every 3 hours on what the weather in the North Atlantic was.
With no way to complete the repairs in time, no one could be sure how the building would survive a hurricane's violent punch. But just when everything seemed its darkest, fate intervened, and Ella veered out to sea. New York had dodged what could have been a horrific catastrophe. The repairs were finished, and the Citicorp crisis went unnoticed for almost 20 years. Could there be other skyscrapers out there with serious structural problems that will only be discovered once it's too late?
There are lots of buildings that move too much, that make people uncomfortable in the wind. I have knowledge of one important building, because I was called in as a private consultant to the owners, and it was clearly in serious danger because of engineering failure. The building has now been fixed, so I don't need to worry about it anymore. Without knowing details about other buildings, one can only suspect.
But suspicion will never quell the urge to build tall. In fact, the desire to build taller than ever is alive and well, and it's no longer just an American obsession. In 1996, Malaysia took the title of world's tallest building from Chicago, with completion of the Petronas Twin Towers, which squeaked past the Sears by a mere 33 feet. For the first time in the history of the skyscraper, the tallest building in the world was not in the United States.
It was never the intention to build the tallest building, because we always thought a year later somebody is going to build a tower taller. We started off 88-story. Then we found out we were just 5 meters short of the Sears Tower, and we said, why not go over that? And we did it.
The Petronas Towers are located in Malaysia's capital, Kuala Lumpur. Although this might seem an unlikely place to find the world's tallest building, the towers were built for familiar reasons.
With international interest that being the tallest buildings in the world created, it put Malaysia on the international scene with the right symbol and character. These are towers that can be seen internationally as being extraordinary towers.
But Malaysia wanted more than just the world's tallest. It wanted a skyscraper that would reflect its culture.
When we were asked to design these towers, there was nothing to refer to in Malaysia, because Malaysia is a country really brand new at all respects, with very little architectural tradition.
For this young country, Pelly drew on much older motifs from Islam, Malaysia's official religion.
The floor plate mainly is actually two squares skewed and hence form 8 pointed stars. Yeah? And this is actually the basic concept in Islamic architecture.
When the image is new, it can be associated with a place. Like the Eiffel Tower, it had nothing to do with what had been there in Paris before. Same with the Petronas Towers. They represent Southeast Asian, Malaysian sensitivity, and they will forever be seen as Malaysian.
And like the Eiffel Tower, much of the Petronas Tower's strong new image stems from innovative engineering. Pelly joined the two towers 41 stories in the air with a unique double-deck sky bridge. The bridge improves everyday circulation of people between the towers and provides an escape route from one tower to the other in case of emergency. Since the towers bend and twist in the wind, the sky bridge could not be rigidly fastened to them, or it would be ripped to shreds. The solution was to support the bridge on two pairs of legs, which allow it to glide about a foot in and out of the towers.
It can skew. And actually, the bridge moves up and down slightly, because when the towers move in, the bridge is pushed up, and when the towers move away from each other, it sort of sinks in the middle.
At the extreme height of the Petronas Towers, feats of engineering are required for even the most mundane tasks, like keeping 34 acres of glass and stainless steel clean. The work never stops, since it takes 3 months to wash each tower just once. The Petronas Tower's distinctive design has made them the crown jewel of Malaysia. But it's only a matter of time before another place sets its sights on the title of world's tallest. Before the Petronas Towers were even officially open, Chicago started plotting to recapture the prize with a sleek, cutting-edge skyscraper called 7 South Dearborn that will beat Petronas by 70 feet. But how much longer can this battle for height continue? Is the sky really the limit?
Technologically, we can always keep going taller, but the complications as we go taller become greater and greater, not only in terms of structural engineering, but also in terms of simple common sense, that the higher you go, the more elevators you need. The more elevators you need, the more space they take up. The more space you take up with elevators, the fatter a building gets. The fatter a building gets, the more the lower floors are really filled primarily with space for elevators to go to the upper floors.
I don't think we can keep on extending our buildings forever, but we are not yet close to the reasonable limits.
Until we reach those limits, architects and engineers will continue to dream. The Japanese have designed a conical skyscraper almost half a mile high. As yet, there are no plans to build it, and such cities in the sky are likely to remain just a fantasy for now. But maybe not forever.
People want to build tall for 2 reasons. First, because leaving great structures is a way a culture is remembered. So skyscrapers are cathedrals and pyramids to our culture today. That's part of it. The other is, I think, human nature has always wanted to use what technology it invents. The technology that lets us go high is one that we can't hold ourselves back from using. It's part of that human drive to use what tools we have. We've always done that.